the next session will be the project report and summary for the 5 moderators from the session 1.
I will be moderating the next 50 minutes of session reports from yesterday. So my name is Tadej Belka. I'm from University of Ljubljana in Slovenia. It's quite sunny here, quite hot. Don't know where you are, but I hope you also have a nice day so far. So joining me will be the 5 moderators from yesterday's session 1. We'll go in the same order of appearance as they presented or moderated yesterday's session. So this will be Neil Sang, Guoping Huang, Diana Dabovic, John Wilson, and Aaron Liggett. I believe all of them are here, so I propose we go on and not waste any more time. So just to recap how we'll do this the same as yesterday's sessions. First, we'll go through the 5 reports, and during those reports, you can write your questions in the chat box. And after we finish with the reports, I will read the questions to the presenters for them to answer. And after that, we can have also an open mic session if there will be any more questions to address. Okay, so I think that's it for the introduction. I would now like to give microphone to Neil Sang to give his presentation. Neil, please take over.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah? Yeah, great. So hello, I'm Neil Sang. I'm a researcher in GIS at SLU in Sweden. I'm reporting for session 1. So we had 3 presenters. The first was Jessica Deal presenting a project called Grown in Singapore, which was looking at urban agriculture in a dense urban setting. Then Ana Clara Mora presented on trees for Belo Horizonte metropolitan region, and Thiago Marino presented trees for Rio de Janeiro metropolitan region. So the first discussion, we also followed the order of presentation, and the first discussion settled around questions of attention between different goals and how different design teams with different priorities would deal with different goals, particularly in this case, environmental goals and economic goals from the SDGs, for example, 7 and 10. So it was an interesting discussion around how different teams and priorities impacted the design, but then how they would then go from different designs down to a single design. Now, in contrast to that idea of trying to get integration and leading directly off from the previous discussion in the last session, there was also the question of how to deal with a great deal of contrast between, for example, the biotopes that we saw presented earlier from Brazil, because these are not easy to compare. And I hope we'll come back to that in our discussion, because I think that's really at the heart of IGC, actually, is how you find that range of convenience between sufficient flexibility, but no more. That's a really difficult question that sits at the heart of this, and they're like a microcosm of that problem. I suspect everybody will have also discussed remote teaching, which we did a lot. Of course, we specifically looked at GIS Collab as one tool, but also we talked about whiteboards and the pros and cons of having to teach remotely. Actually, a surprising number of positives. For example, Jessica explained that she managed to teach her course while in a completely different country from all of her students, which is remarkable, I think. But as part of that, of course, that's because we now have software coming online which can support this very well. And it is now effective. But from my point of view, one of the most interesting comments was from Thiago, talking about it's not just getting the software right and developing the software, it's the training, it's the videos, it's the support that allows this to reach a very broad diversity of potential users, because they had lots of professionals and students in there. And that context is really quite essential to making this remote teaching work. So that's pretty much my summary.
Thank you, Neil. I propose we move on now to Guoping Huang, if he is here present. He said he might have some troubles. Okay, perfect. So yes, good.
You can hear me, great.
Can go.
So on our panel, we have 3 projects investing in some very distinctive ethnographic, eco-climatic, and socioeconomic areas in 5 different continents. And the first project, spatial development scenarios for Slovenia, national, regional, and local scales from the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia. The project is the continuation of last year's Geodesign project at a regional scale, but this time they expanded to national and local scale. I think such multi-scale approach makes it possible to see how national strategies could be played out at a local scale, as evidenced by this project, which I believe is quite unique at this IGC conference. I think that this kind of approach also opens the door for questions like, what if national interests are different from the local interests? What if they are even contradictory? And it also allows us to think about how local interventions can impact policies at a national level as the challenges set forward by yesterday's keynote speaker. Now, because 60% of Slovenia is covered by forest, which ranks it among the most forested countries in Europe, their national strategies are mainly about food security, renewable energy production, decarbonization, and dealing with climate change, etc. The discussion after the presentation was mainly about their local scale investigation, the low carbon future in the Solarska Valley, their intervention to use trees for biomass energy production is quite different from other projects, but apparently addresses their local needs. Without it, according to their non-adopter scenario, the local community will bear a lot of negative impacts from still the current coal, fossil fuel energy production, and also a failure of transition will cause a loss of jobs. What's also interesting is that this project is done mainly by first-year MLA students. We should pay attention to the next panel about their learning experience in that project. The second project in our panel is titled "The Wood for the Trees" from Norwegian University of Life Sciences and the Leibniz University, Hanover, Germany. And the project is also a continuation of last year's project, if you remember, presented by Jörg, about global sand production in building industry. But this time, he and his colleagues looked at trees as an important material for building industry. The pros and cons comparison between cement and wood contextualized their geodesign workshop that tried to strategize building material systems in 3 big metro cities, metro areas, Mexico City, Yangon, and Lagos. They concluded that there are 2 viable scenarios given the SDG assessment, land consumption, etc. These 2 scenarios are low density housing plus low hybrid building material system, or a high density housing plus high hybrid building material system, meaning that they use more wood as a renewable kind of material in the future. Again, just like the first project, their project is looking at trees as materials, as commodities for building industry beyond carbon capture or green infrastructure, as discussed in most of other projects at IGC. And that is why during our brief discussion, participants discussed things like the cost and the benefits of using wood in broader terms. And personally, I think this is really important because when I, for example, according to my experience, when I discuss reforestation projects in Africa with folks from maybe the World Bank, we not only look at tree species that can contribute to conservation, but also looking at species that contribute to subsistence farming, as well as species that can actually establish value chain in some of the developing countries so that they can actually promote local economy. So I think the commercial value of those trees actually are very important in the real world. But inevitably, because of this kind of separated kind of consumption and production separated in this industry, the authors of the project also point out, for example, such kind of practice will lead to injustice in wood consumption and production worldwide. The third project is titled Trees for Macapá Metropolitan Region from the Amapá State Secretary of Transport in Brazil. And this is a project, as you already know, is part of a broader Trees for Metropolitan Regions in Brazil study, as you have just learned from Professor Ana Clara Moura. In addition to some of the general requirements for the project, such as to increase vegetation coverage by 30%, this particular project also set some specific requirements, such as further control, water sanitation, etc., based on their local conditions. Geodesign process allowed articulation and the negotiation of spatialized ideas during their workshops. Unlike previous projects that were conducted in a university studio setting, this project actually held workshops with real stakeholders, which I think personally is very, very interesting. What is really, really valuable, I think, is that the project itself, the poster also included assessment of the workshop experience, as well as the assessment of the platforms they have used, including the perception of the platform by those participants. The presenter noted that many participants, because they often work in the government sector, many participants were very traditional and are reluctant to adopt proposed innovations, such as renewable energy, etc. They apparently care more about their immediate, urgent concerns, such as flooding problems, etc., which led to some very interesting group discussions afterwards, including whether, for example, simple pins or polygon diagrams are more effective in such circumstances. Personally, I think as geodesigners, we should act, of course, reactively, in other words, trying to address some of the local concern, but at the same time, I think we should also act proactively, trying to bring some new visions to the community, because geodesign offers a framework with associated tools to allow spatial negotiation between sometimes seemingly contradictory goals. However, because in our session we had a long presentation and an unexpected technical glitch, we didn't have enough time for extended group discussion. But I'm hoping that we could continue some of the topics here at this panel. I'm sorry that I have to fulfill some family obligations, but I will still stay online, even though I'm probably not able to participate in the discussion actively. So I'm asking my colleagues at my panel to help me answer some of the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Guoping. If there will be any questions, I might try to answer them about this session. So moving on, we have now a presentation by Tijana.
Hello, everybody. Okay, I'm Tijana Dabovic. I'm from University of Belgrade, and I will present the summary from the P3 session 1. In this session, we had 3 very different projects again. One project was from Brazil, that was trees for Goiânia metropolitan region. Second one was Germany, about Heidelberg Greenbelt, and the third one was development scenarios for Haran in Turkey. I have structured the summary in 3 main elements, from peculiarities to some reflections, and then we will move into aspirations. You will see later on in the panel why this was structured like this. But I thought that it would be good if we have a certain structure. As I highlighted at the beginning, these different contexts, settings within which workshops were conducted and also different national socioeconomic contexts produced certain peculiarities and differences between the projects that were presented. First of all, very good results of non-adopter in the SDGs impact assessment metrics in the Brazilian case provoked the question of why would anyone want to change the status quo planning if it leads to improvements of the SDGs. And this is something that we also heard Ana Clara mentioning. So this initiated a discussion about the settings of conducting the workshops. We had solely academic settings in Goiânia, dominantly academic, but with the participation of local representatives in Haran, and mixed academic and local representatives in Heidelberg. These different settings, together with different national socioeconomic contexts, compose different backgrounds of making scenarios. So this is how it was explained why non-adopter SDGs metrics in the Brazilian case was so innovative. It was because the background of Brazilian students was extremely innovative. So this was the result of those kind of interplay of backgrounds and settings. The second point that was kind of peculiar because it was shown within the context. It was the case of Heidelberg Greenbelt, which actually was explaining how green government and its planning department in Heidelberg, which approached academics to make the design, how their reaction to more diverse set of diagrams that were offered in the workshop by students, especially housing and green energy development, were not very positive at the beginning. So that was a kind of peculiar looking at into what were the context in Turkey and in Brazil. So the focus of this green government and their planners was on the protection of the green belt and not on other needs such as housing, which was found problematic, especially with regard to attractiveness of the region and expected population growth. In the continuation, that kind of provoked the conclusion and the necessity of really confirming that third world countries have problems in following the standards from the developed countries, especially because the conservative and profit-oriented politicians, in this case we had Brazil, but I can confirm the same is happening in Serbia, tend to ignore academic recommendations which do not justify their usual activities, and they usually kind of divert from their business as usual. So this is why it is hard in these countries to follow the standards of the more developed countries that have, or countries that have other attitudes of politicians and elites. When we were talking about reflections of the and experiences of the project, the colleague from Germany acknowledged that the reached consensus on the design of the Heidelberg Greenbelt between students and local representatives really indicated the change in participants' positions and perceptions. Then we had the reflection about the very important value of geodesign because of the introduction of SDGs and carbon credit and more active learning and application of previously learned concepts in a real case study. And that was perceived as very valuable in the Goiânia case. In the Haran case, geodesign was really recognized as a perfect methodology for conducting the real world projects because it gets different stakeholders into negotiation, and this secures better level of implementation of the project. But it was also acknowledged that it is very hard to conduct the entire the geodesign in its full potential in one semester, especially now with the online teaching and problems with internet in some countries. So we had a recommendation from Michele. He said that if there is a one semester for geodesign assigned, then perhaps it would be better for educators to do the preparation for the workshop and then to get students directly into the workshops with everything already being prepared. And as of aspirations, once their presenters were asked if they would use the IGC technology methodology again, all the presenters confirmed their willingness to do so. And in more general terms, it was highlighted that geodesign can innovate the programs in spatial disciplines by enabling application of innovative international concepts, and that this would enable students to be more responsible and better prepared for the global challenges once they move into practice. Also, in Olaf, colleague from Germany, said that geodesign, in his experience, really enables much better use of the abundant amount of data towards better designs. Unfortunately, we didn't have enough time to go into how design methods are supposed to be, how the data, using the data has to be, use of the data has to be kind of influenced by particular design methods. We didn't have, unfortunately, chance to discuss this. So this was our summary. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So moving on, we now have John Wilson. John, are you with us?
Muted. So I'll try to be
perfect.
I'll try to be quick. I'm from the University of Southern California, and I was the moderator for the P4 session 1. We had 3 excellent talks, one by Tom Fisher about Minneapolis, one by Ana Clara Moura about the Salvador metropolitan region, and one by Tiago Costa about decision-making in geodesign in Belém in Brazil. And I understand that we'll be able to access recordings of those later. So I'm just going to focus my comments on what our discussion was about. So the first topic we discussed was the fact that the talk about carbon credits, all 3 projects spoke of how they could be increased, but the outcomes are not bounded. So if we go back to the opening keynote by Peter Drobia, we can't tell from the results of the projects whether the outcomes would be carbon neutral or carbon negative or just incremental progress towards those goals. Another big part of our discussion was really our admiration for the Brazilian studies, for their vision, for their execution, and there was quite a few questions around the cadence. In other words, what parts of their workflow went well, what parts were a bit of a struggle, and I think I understood that it was easy to point out what the problems were, but it was quite a bit more difficult to mobilize intellectual energy around, well, what could we do about those? And then the last big part of our discussion was about the fact that you know, while we were focused on carbon sequestration, there are many broader benefits of trees. And so how would we incorporate the benefit of an urban forest, say, for heat and pollution mitigation? What would we need to do in order to be able to talk persuasively, intelligently about health benefits? And then towards the very end, there was a very nice discussion about the importance of, these days at least, looking at these kinds of issues through an equity lens. So that was sort of the session in a nutshell. There was no discussion of remote teaching. And just me speaking as an academic and an administrator here, what I find problematic about our cadence so far is not that we can't do a workshop in a semester, but I'd like to advocate again for faster and more far-reaching planning. So I'd like to know at least a year in advance what the topic's going to be, so that I can mobilize my colleagues and myself, so that we have an opportunity to participate by conducting our own workshops. So there, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much for also being brief, to leave us some more space for a discussion later. Okay, yeah. Moving on to the last one, we have Aaron.
Hello, I'm Aaron Liggett. I'm a landscape architect and lecturer at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo in California. The 3 projects that were presented in our session was planting for trees in Fortaleza, Brazil, developing strategies to greening up or developing vacant lots in Hartford, Connecticut, and how to save urban parks in Seoul, Korea. How to save or preserve parks that are at risk to dissolving or changing into different land uses based off of private ownership. I will discuss specific questions that were addressed to each of these teammates and the discussion that arose from them. The Brazilian group that focused on greening up or planting trees in Fortaleza, Brazil, they had a very extremely different approach than the other Brazilian groups. The other group that had a methodology that split up the different regions within that region into landscape units based off of geographic location, the ecology, and then the land uses within each of those distinct areas. What was interesting, the outcome that was very informative, was the way that they selected their sample size and presented their sample size or sample design of the outcomes of implementing the outcomes of the parametric modeling. They selected a sample that wasn't too small, where you actually saw site design, but it wasn't too large where it was very diagrammatic as to where the trees would be located. There's a medium scale, approximately 2 by 2 kilometers, so you could actually see the individual trees. It created infographics where you could actually see the trees, which really had I think a profound impact on the outcomes or the results and how it actually looked and the significance of it. So the scale that they decided to present was different and I think very effective. The project on greening the vacant lots, the question was asked how the selection of property, the amount of lots to green or to plant trees was somewhat modest compared to the outcomes of other studies. All the vacant lots weren't necessarily selected. And that's because the participant decided to focus on connectivity. So they created a scope, a matrix that was more prescribed and more detailed, should I say. They focused on connectivity, selecting public land use, and the amount of existing greenery, which eliminated a lot of the different lots. So they were more focused on the most appropriate locations rather than trying to green everything. Which will relate to a discussion that we had from the based off the last assignment, which was saving these urban parks. Issue in Seoul is a lot of the existing parks right now are deemed unexecutable, meaning there are parts of them are privately owned. Based off of a Supreme Court decision, is that these privately owned portions of the parks could be dissolved, meaning in X number of years, the owners can now repurpose that land into whatever different land uses, which would essentially eliminate the parks. Two very distinct strategies was interesting based off of the early adapter and the late adapter. The early adapter being use all the money you have, all the cities and municipalities' money to purchase and to maintain as many of the existing parks as possible, purchasing them from the private landowners. While the late adapter was a different approach, is select a few of those properties, try to make a profit off them, and then with the new generated income, then go back and buy as much land as possible. So really focus on making money first rather than spending it first. Which then led to a discussion on how to select, or strategies to select the most appropriate sites to green or maintain a park, where particularly that are currently owned by private companies. Should we prioritize public lands when determining what lands to select? Or on another note, could it even be more beneficial, more expedited to work with private owners to develop these private public ownerships or collaborations, so that you are generating money, or private ownerships are generating money while they're responsible for providing green space? And by incorporating these private owners, you're using less taxpayer money. So you might convince the public, convince the municipalities into greening more spaces because they're not going to front all the costs, and it'll open up different possibilities to better solutions rather than just solely focusing on public lands. If you bring in private ownership into the mix, the solutions, the outcomes will be different and possibly more effective. So that was kind of the major discussion that we had towards the end, is the feasibility, the benefits of having a public partner ownership as compared to just focusing on public lands. That wrapped up our conversation.
Thank you, Aaron, for this last report. So this gives us some time now for discussion. We have about 20 minutes, a bit less. I see Brian is very active in the chat, writing a question almost for every presenter. I mean, from the discussion, you all address this diversity of both contexts and approaches to solving different spatial and social problems. And this is also a question by Brian about this this flexibility and adaptability. And a question to Neil by Brian was if you think that a typology of adaptability developed by IGC could facilitate in addressing different contexts, typology in a sense of describing what is essential and what can be flexible at different sizes of projects.
Yeah, clearly there's a scale related issue there in that, you know, as you go for larger spatial extents, you probably want to have less thematic detail. And certainly for my own project in Loma, which is very small, the thematic choice of the 10 systems, there's definitely a sense that both the students and the professionals in the previous project, it didn't fit their range of convenience. They wanted nuance in terms of green space, for example. Well, it'd be interesting to see whether we can develop a typology. I think it'd be quite hard. We might end up just with a more complicated version that people still don't necessarily feel fits their range of convenience. But I do think we can start to look at how to make complying with a common framework more convenient. So to give two examples of that, in the case of the trees, the Trillion Trees project this time around, we could supply tools and software that gave a standard way of counting the number of trees or counting the carbon, for example. Maybe we could look at that through tools. And I was very struck by the example from Brazil where you had one group that only wanted to work with tables. And I thought, well, you don't want to push them to work on the map because they won't appreciate that. They're likely to walk away. On the other hand, with the parametric modeling group, you know, the parametric modeling is a perfect way to take general principles from a tabular approach and turn it into space. So if we have those kind of tool supports maybe developing, that could also help us square this circle a bit.
Thank you. I'd actually like to extend this question to all the other presenters, as all of you had to kind of compare the project. So how did you find that the different projects follow the IGC templates, and what were the distinctions? How did they benefit or maybe deter from having a clear comparison? So who'd like to go first? Maybe Tiana.
Well, that's a tricky one. I'm new in this, and I had the problem of really understanding the scenarios, for example, the logic of scenarios. So in my interpretation, the current 2020, for example, was the early 2020. So I think that perhaps we can talk about adding a square adding current 2020 and then having early adopter 2020 and then early adopter 2035 and 2050, because I have noticed that some of the projects didn't have early, or they were treating early adopter 2020 as a current 2020. So I didn't know how this can how is this contributing to comparability. And also the point was how to calculate the impacts. Are we calculating the impacts ex post? For example, if we have current 2020 and then we have innovations, then we are supposing the impacts of those scenarios. So that for me, but I'm not very experienced. This is the first project. I was really thinking of how I can interpret this in a proper way, so in order to be comparable to other projects. That was but the main thing I think that I find that some projects do not have the same logic of scenarios. I don't know how others feel about this.
Are there any other thoughts from the presenters?
This is John. I appreciate all the different points of view, and I rather see the kinds of directions we've used for the last 3 years for the various projects as kind of inspiration more than guidance about the exact execution. And so, you know, personally, I would favor us continuing kind of the current path, and you know, at least there were elements about the 3 talks in my session that was super aspirational, and they weren't directly comparable to Carl's point and perhaps some other people's points, but they were similar enough that, you know, with a little bit of work, you could draw common elements and the distinctions between them, and there's some value in being able to do that as well as the kind of arguments that come with the alternatives.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
I think similar enough is the key word here. So maybe I'll jump in for Guoping, as Brian also addressed the question to me directly. So the question was, how did nesting the projects from Slovenia's case? So we went from national, regional, local help in creating the same or addressing the same adaptability issues, and if we have any conclusions about the value versus challenges of such local, regional to national studies. Well, first off, I think the value lies in the challenges, actually. Of course, as you go into larger scales, so smaller areas, it becomes increasingly difficult to mold your designs into the IGC model. And I think here it actually helps to start at a smaller scale, larger areas, where you have these more general categories in which you are planning as well, that are also closer, I would say, to the systems proposed by the IGC. And as you go then lower into more local scales, then it becomes easier to actually pinpoint or better define how these large diagrams then become reality in the local scales. And because you have that background, that thought about why you decided the diagram to be agriculture, not forestry, it's then also easier to classify it in the local scale. Of course, as we go on each year, the faculty as well here learns a few things, but I guess the most rigid element of the IGC each year are the innovations. Sometimes it's quite hard to apply them to our local context or national context, to Slovenian context, let's say. And often we prefer to actually use innovations that are more of a local, let's say, meaning or something like that. Often it also doesn't really matter between the difference between a late adopter or non-adopter and early adopter is not in which innovations they adopt, but how they implement them in the landscape or in the space. Okay, so not to take too much time, I'm the moderator, so I must moderate myself as well. an interesting comment was made by Brian to Tiana's presentation. And he observed that looking across the projects presented this year, it seems clear that those who have now done multiple projects have moved toward more engagement of the people of the place. They probably become more self-confident in doing the method. Yeah, exactly. That's what was Tiana's comment. And I see Neil raising his hand.
Yes, well, I raised my hand there because in effect, I went the opposite direction. So I started off working with the professionals in the local area. And then this time around, I had students who were reflecting on theirs and then making their own design. And I'd just like to connect this to one of the points that John made in terms of, I think you called it cadence, in terms of how we organize this. One of the reasons I would really like to do a project where we actually have the students directly talking to people in the area or have some kind of survey set up and so on. But that takes a lot of forward planning, particularly with GDPR. And if you want to work with public authorities here, there's a lot of hoops and rules and people to be asked permission of and so on. And that therefore really does restrict what one can do.
Thank you.
Yeah, can I just say something that I would add to that, and that is if we want to do what Neil says and work with the local residents and so forth, my experience in Los Angeles is that trees are personal, and so what you have to do is connect individual people to individual trees if you actually want to change the world. And so I would just second what Neil said. It would be really helpful in all of these cases if we knew what the appetite was for the kinds of innovations that we were talking about. In some cases, I think we'd be pleasantly surprised, and unfortunately, in some cases, I think we might not be pleasantly surprised.
Okay, Aaron has his hand up.
Yes, hi. I want to jump into something Neil said as it relates to the question that Brian asked me in the chat, in terms of restricting ourselves based off of what we think is feasible or based off of the restrictions that we anticipate based off the local government and policies, which are important factors in getting these projects realized. However, if we were to kind of take out that policy of what we believe is possible, of the kind of limiting those restrictions that we set on ourselves based on the existing policy, and make our decisions strictly based off of performance, best outcomes, without kind of that subjective or what we perceive as limitations, we could have totally different outcomes, and we could be surprised and come up with outcomes that actually could be successful. So kind of separating or being able to identify what is kind of limitations based that we're setting on perceived limitations, rather than focusing strictly on performance and then trying to attack to see if we could overcome the policies that may restrict the actual viability of implementing these approaches or these outcomes.
Thank you. So we have 5 minutes left. So I think John mentioned that it would be good to have some information about how the IGC will be conducted, or which metrics, or how the performance will be graded a bit more in advance. To which Brian responded that among academics, it is often not possible to know what we will be doing a year ahead with changing teaching and research assignments. So are there any thoughts on how we could address this? Maybe by John first. This is his.
Well, I did reply that perhaps I'm in a very privileged spot in the sense that I'm both an academic and an administrator, and so the only hassle in this for me is that whatever I want to do, I need to get it approved by the higher ups, sort of 18 to 24 months ahead of when I actually do it. And so if we announce the project each year a few months before the academic year starts, then I'm half a year too late, and I can't get a studio approved in order to run the kinds of projects that you've all been successfully running. And so I would just advocate that, you know, in our new structure that we're going to talk about perhaps later today and tomorrow morning, that we think about, you know, could we have a cadence for the organization where we were simultaneously sort of planning 2 conferences so that we move forward that way.
Yeah, maybe to respond to this from the Slovenia's point of view as well. I see Neil raised his hand. I will be brief. We actually have quite a, let's say, predictable schedule, and our faculty, our professors are quite autonomous on deciding how they will lead their studio. But it would, of course, be beneficial to have information before so we could prepare for that. But I guess it really matters how institutional design changes from place to place. I will now give the word to Neil, and then I think I saw Carl also raise his hand. Okay,
yeah, I'd just like to make a point that if we want to expand this, I mean, I'm trying to shoehorn this into a GIS course. Basically, I don't have a studio. I don't have that kind of setup. And if we want to bring in more people from, say, geography schools and so on, and I would hope we do, then maybe we need to think about the fact that they don't necessarily teach in studio courses. Mm-hmm. And one way to achieve that without kind of breaking the whole system could be to have more regional efforts. So smaller groupings that get together with, you know, regional workshops and so on to build stuff up that might eventually, over a longer time scale, get to the global meeting.
All right. Go ahead.
Tadej, your group at Ljubljana had a unique structure this year. How was the inter-faculty relationship making 3 different studios? Making 3 different studios in the roughly same language but at different scales. Were people satisfied with making that decision across a department, basically? Because I think that model is a very, very important experiment to say, we're going to do in one department in 1 year a national, a regional, and 12 local studies in the same rough language so that we can see what each other are doing and understand each other. What was the faculty response to that decision?
We have a minute left, but I think this is a great bridge to next session where Mojca, who is actually the professor, will talk about this, but I will briefly respond, of course. First, this project was made in actually a 2-part studio, which is run every year, and the structure is pretty much the same. The first half of the year is a planning studio, and the second half of the year is a design studio. And the idea is to have the same students first do a planning exercise and then try to design those planning ideas in the local scale. So this approach to this year's IGC fitted very nicely into our general design of the studio. We observed that a lot more should be done in the junction of these two, because in this case, it is not simply I don't believe it's simply a case of, you know, jumping scales and just picking areas from the national design to designing the local, but it should be more of a problem definition. So which problems from the national scope are actually those that are, I don't know, most critical or most interesting or whatever to do in the design scope. And I think that in the design scopes, I don't think any of the design faculty is right here now, so I can say that they are maybe not so much used to having such a rigid systematic structure, especially they're not used to thinking in scenarios. You know, usually they took the early adopter, which was considered the best case, and simply followed that through. And scenarios were not really made for all of the design teams of students later. except for one team which we presented here, who actually did the scenarios and thought about more about how that site could develop. And I think the example that we showed was actually linked the tightest to the national scale, because it really addressed the energy problem of the whole Slovenia in a local scale. So I will leave it at that, and I hope Mojca, I think she's here, will elaborate some more on this.
Good.
So thank you to everyone who participated in this session. Thank you to the presenters for really sticking to their time and enabling this lively discussion. Have a nice day, continue enjoying this conference, and we'll see you later.